The stale smell of disinfectant. Another ward, another forgotten face. He lay there, a ghost in his own life, unclaimed. No bustling family, no concerned visitors, just the rhythmic sigh of the ventilator. He wasn't a difficult patient, just invisible. How many like him fade away unnoticed, swallowed by the system? This isn't a story of heroism or grand gestures. It's about the quiet tragedy of being overlooked, a life reduced to medical notes and feeding tubes. But even in silence, a single spark can ignite a revolution. This is how one man's passing exposed a broken system and forced us to confront our own indifference. He came in on a Tuesday, frail as a sparrow, gray hair thinning on top. Kind eyes, though. He just looked lost. No family with him, no one to vouch for him, just a battered suitcase and a quiet resignation. They said he'd been found by a neighbor, wandering the streets, confused. Admitted alone, dwindling savings, barely enough to cover his rent, let alone any decent care. Forgotten. That's the word that kept circling in my head. Alistair Finch, 58, was on shift as well, a consultant, balding, and always immaculately dressed. At first, he seemed attached, all business and clinical assessments, but underneath, I always sensed a flicker of something more. Arthur wasn't a demanding patient, truth be told, just terribly lonely. He'd sit by the window, watching the leaves fall, clutching this old pocket watch, a keepsake of some sort, a tangible link to a past that seemed to be slipping away from him like sand through his fingers. I'd try to chat, just general things, asking about his day, his life. He'd smile politely, but the conversation never really went anywhere. He was polite but withdrawn, almost as if he'd given up on being heard. The problem is, you see it all the time. The system stretched thinner than butter on stale bread. Elderly patients, without anyone to advocate for them, just slip through the cracks. Their needs are met, minimally, but the human connection, the genuine care, that's often the first thing to go. I documented everything in my nursing notebook, a record of observations, medications, and the creeping unease in my gut. We were short-staffed, as usual, running around like headless chickens, trying to juggle 10 patients at once. Arthur just existed. We'd make sure he was fed, medicated, clean, but there wasn't much more. No time to really listen to him, to understand him. And that's what gnawed at me. We were treating the body, but completely ignoring the soul. One evening, I found him staring intently at his pocket watch. I stopped to chat with him, as I always do when I can. "That's a lovely watch, Arthur," I said gently. He looked up, startled, then smiled faintly. "It was my father's," he said, his voice raspy with disuse. "He gave it to me when I left for the war." "The war?" I asked, surprised. "You were in the war?" He nodded. "Aye, long time ago now. Seems like another life." He paused, his eyes clouding over with memories. So much lost. That was the closest I ever got to him really opening up. He told me about his childhood, his time in the army, his wife, Margaret, who'd passed away years ago. He spoke of a life full of love and laughter, of hardship and sacrifice. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the conversation ended. He seemed to tire, his eyes grew heavy, and he drifted off to sleep, the pocket watch clutched tightly in his hand. I left him then, my heart heavy. I knew, deep down, that he didn't have much time left. And the thought of him dying alone, forgotten, just broke me. Christmas Eve, 2018. I was on the night shift. The ward was quiet, a hushed stillness hanging in the air, punctuated only by the rhythmic beeping of the machines. I checked on Arthur. He was sleeping, his breathing shallow and labored. The bedside monitor, a cold clinical device, flashed his vital signs. I sat with him for a while, holding his hand. It was cold and frail, but I held it tight, trying to transmit some warmth, some comfort. I thought about my own family, gathered around the Christmas tree, laughing and celebrating. And here was Arthur, alone, facing his final hours. He passed away early on the morning of January 3, 2019. It wasn't sudden, but it was stark. Just me, him, and the beeping machines. No family, no friends, no one to hold his hand as he slipped away. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork and procedures. Arthur's belongings were cataloged, his flat cleared out. He became just another file, another statistic. And that's what enraged me. He was more than a file. He was a person. It was after Arthur was gone that things started to change. His death, his quiet, undignified exit sparked something. I couldn't let it go. I spoke to Alistair Finch, told him about my concerns, my feelings of guilt and helplessness. To my surprise, he listened, really listened. He arranged a meeting, a ward review. We sat around a stark, functional table in the hospital meeting room. Doctors, nurses, administrators. The atmosphere was tense. I laid it all out, the truth of Arthur's case, the neglect he faced, the systemic failures that allowed him to slip through the cracks. It wasn't easy. There was resistance, defensiveness, but I persisted. I showed them the notes in my notebook, the dates, the times, the missed opportunities. I spoke of Arthur's loneliness, his quiet dignity, his forgotten life. Alistair Finch backed me up. He spoke of the need for compassion, for empathy, for a fundamental shift in how we cared for our elderly patients. The conversation was difficult, uncomfortable, but it was necessary. And it led to action. A review of patient care policies, increased funding for social workers, a greater emphasis on patient advocacy. It wasn't a miraculous transformation, but it was a start. Arthur's story exposed the brutal reality of elder care within the system. It forced a reckoning. It changed how we looked at loneliness, at poverty, and at our responsibility to those most vulnerable. His life, however seemingly insignificant in the grand scheme, left an indelible mark on a broken system. It pushed for change, so no other Arthur gets lost in the shuffle. We implemented a system where every elderly patient admitted alone is assigned a dedicated advocate, someone to visit them, to listen to them, to ensure their needs are met. It's not perfect, but it's a step in the right direction. I still think about Arthur, often. I see his face in the faces of other elderly patients, lost and alone. And I remember the lesson he taught me, that even those without a voice deserve dignity, that even the smallest act of kindness can make a difference, and that even in the face of a failing system, we can still choose to care. And that, in the end, is all that truly matters. It wasn't a grand, sweeping victory, but a quiet, hard-won acknowledgement that every life, no matter how seemingly insignificant, has value. And that's a legacy worth fighting for. Right, so after that ward review, things felt different. Not immediately better, mind you, but different. There was a palpable tension in the air, a sense that everyone knew things couldn't go on as they had been. Finch, surprisingly, became a real champion for change. He'd always seemed a bit aloof, wrapped up in his medical world, but Arthur's case seemed to have shaken him. The biggest change was the advocate system. It started small, a pilot scheme, but it was something. Any elderly patient admitted without family, without support, would be assigned a volunteer, someone to visit them, chat to them, make sure their needs were being met, not just medically, but emotionally. I volunteered, of course. I couldn't not. It felt like the least I could do, a way to atone for not having done enough for Arthur. My first advocate patient was a woman named Agnes. She was 88, a bit confused, but with a spark in her eye. She'd been found wandering in the park, disoriented and alone, just like Arthur. She had no family to speak of. I visited Agnes every day, sat with her, held her hand, listened to her stories. She told me about her life, her husband, her children, her garden. She talked about the things she'd lost, the things she missed, and she talked about her fears, her loneliness, her fear of dying alone. It was exhausting, juggling my nursing duties with my advocate work, but it was also incredibly rewarding. I could see the difference it made in Agnes's face, the light that returned to her eyes when I walked into the room. She wasn't just a patient anymore, she was a person. One afternoon, I found Finch in Agnes's room, chatting with her. I was surprised, but pleased. "Just making sure Agnes is being well looked after," he said with a smile. "And she is, thanks to you." I smiled back, feeling a sense of hope I hadn't felt in a long time. But things weren't perfect, not by a long shot. The system was still stretched thin, resources were still limited, and some people still didn't see the point. One day, I overheard two nurses talking in the staff room. "What's the point of all this advocate nonsense?" one of them said. "We've got enough to do without babysitting lonely old people." "Yeah," the other agreed. "It's not like it's going to cure them, is it?" I wanted to say something, to defend Arthur, to defend Agnes, to defend the whole damn system, but I didn't. I just walked away, feeling deflated and defeated. Later that day, Agnes took a turn for the worse. She'd been stable for weeks, but suddenly her breathing became labored, her heart rate erratic. We did everything we could, but it wasn't enough. She slipped away peacefully, with me by her side, holding her hand. I was devastated. I felt like I'd failed her, just like I'd failed Arthur. After Agnes passed away, I was going through her things to hand over to the authorities, and I found a small, worn photo album in her bedside drawer. It was filled with pictures of her family, her husband, her children, her grandchildren. I had never seen the photographs before. It was heartbreaking. She never told me. Her death hit me harder than Arthur's, I think. Maybe because I'd gotten to know her. Maybe because I'd seen the difference I could make. Maybe because I knew that, despite my best efforts, she'd still died alone. I started to question everything. Was I making a difference? Was the advocate system working? Was it all just a waste of time? I went to Finch, told him how I was feeling. He listened patiently, then said, "It's not easy, Eleanor. It never is. But you can't let the failures outweigh the successes. You made a difference in Agnes's life, even if it was just for a few weeks. You gave her comfort, you gave her companionship, you gave her dignity. That's not nothing." He paused, then added, "Arthur's death wasn't in vain. It sparked something, a conversation, a change. It's a slow process, but we're moving in the right direction, and you're a big part of that." His words helped, but the doubt still lingered. Then, a few weeks later, I received a letter. It was from Agnes's daughter, who had finally been tracked down. She wrote to thank me for taking care of her mother, for being there for her in her final days. She said that Agnes had told her all about me, about my visits, about my kindness. She said that I had given her mother peace of mind, knowing that she wasn't alone. Reading that letter, I finally understood. It wasn't about curing people. It wasn't about saving lives. It was about making a difference, however small, in the lives of others. It was about providing comfort, companionship, and dignity to those who needed it most. It was about ensuring that no one was forgotten. The advocate system expanded, becoming a permanent part of St. Jude's. More volunteers came forward, eager to make a difference. We learned from our mistakes, improved our procedures, and refined our approach. We started holding regular training sessions for volunteers, teaching them how to communicate with elderly patients, how to identify their needs, and how to provide emotional support. Finch continued to be a strong advocate for elder care, pushing for more resources, more staff, and more training. He even started giving lectures on the importance of compassion in medicine, using Arthur's story as a cautionary tale. The system wasn't perfect, of course. There were still challenges, still setbacks, still patients who slipped through the cracks. But things were better. We were more aware, more compassionate, more proactive. Arthur's death had changed St. Jude's, not dramatically, not overnight, but subtly, profoundly. It had forced us to confront our own failings, to acknowledge our responsibility to the most vulnerable members of our community. It had reminded us that even the smallest act of kindness can make a world of difference. And that, in the end, was his legacy. Not a grand, sweeping victory, but a quiet, hard-won acknowledgement that every life, no matter how seemingly insignificant, has value. And that's a legacy worth fighting for, a legacy that continues to inspire me every day as I walk the wards of St. Jude's, looking for the next Arthur, the next Agnes, the next forgotten soul in need of a little bit of care. And that's all that truly matters, the quiet dignity. The system is now better because of people like Arthur. The letter from Agnes's daughter, Sarah, it sat on my desk for a good hour before I could bring myself to open it. The crisp paper felt heavy, laden with expectations. I kept thinking, what if she's angry? What if she blames me? What if I did fail? When I finally did read it, the words swam before my eyes. Relief washed over me, so potent it left me trembling. Sarah had written with such grace, such understanding. She explained that she'd lost contact with Agnes years ago, a painful family rift that she deeply regretted. She'd been searching for her, driven by guilt and a desperate need for reconciliation, when she finally received the news of Agnes's passing from the hospital. It wasn't anger in Sarah's words, but gratitude. Gratitude that someone had been there for her mom, someone who had listened, who had cared. She even quoted Agnes, saying her mother had described me as an angel in scrubs. The image made me smile, a watery, exhausted smile. That letter became a sort of talisman. I kept it in my nursing notebook, tucked away amongst the prescription charts and observation records. Whenever I felt overwhelmed, whenever I doubted the value of what I was doing, I'd pull it out and read it again. It was a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness resonated, that they rippled outwards, touching lives in ways I couldn't even imagine. The expansion of the advocate system wasn't without its teething problems, of course. Funding was always tight, staffing was stretched, and there was a constant battle to convince some of the more cynical members of staff that it was worthwhile. We had to develop a robust training program for the volunteers, providing them with the skills and knowledge they needed to support vulnerable patients. We had to navigate complex ethical dilemmas, dealing with issues of confidentiality, consent, and end-of-life care. I spent hours chatting with Derek. His was a great storyteller. So many stories of his time at the docks, of his wife, of his children. He'd show me his tattoos and laugh and tell me he remembered when it was still considered a thing of shame to have them done. I even managed to get the kitchen staff to make him his favorite dish, fish and chips, even though it wasn't strictly on the menu. The look on his face when I brought it to him, well, it made all the struggles worthwhile. I remember one particular evening. It was late, I was exhausted, but I went to check on Derek before I was due to go home. He was sitting up in bed, his breathing labored, but his eyes were clear. He reached out and took my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Eleanor," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. Thank you for seeing me." Those words, "for seeing me," they echoed in my head for days. It was what Arthur had needed, what Agnes had needed, what Derek needed, what we all need, really, to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be valued. Finch's support was invaluable. He understood the challenges we faced, the pressures we were under, the emotional toll it took on us. He secured funding for additional training and resources, and he actively promoted the advocate system throughout the hospital. He even started attending our volunteer meetings, sharing his insights and offering his support. One day, during a particularly difficult meeting, when we were grappling with a complex ethical dilemma involving a patient who lacked capacity, Finch stepped in and offered a perspective that was both compassionate and pragmatic. He reminded us that our primary responsibility was to act in the best interests of the patient, even when it was difficult, even when it meant making unpopular decisions. His words galvanized us, giving us the courage to face the challenge head-on. We worked together, consulted with the patient's family, sought legal advice, and ultimately reached a decision that we believed was both ethical and compassionate. That experience solidified my respect for Finch. I realized that he wasn't just a detached medical professional focused solely on the science of medicine. He was a compassionate human being, deeply committed to the well-being of his patients. The turning point, the moment where the change truly became ingrained in the culture of St. Jude's, came during the annual staff awards. Unexpectedly, Finch nominated the entire advocate team for the Team of the Year award. He spoke passionately about the impact the system had made on patient care, highlighting the dedication and compassion of the volunteers. Before the advocate system, he said, standing at the podium, his voice ringing with sincerity, we were treating patients, but we weren't always seeing people. Arthur's case forced us to confront that reality, to acknowledge that our patients are not just bodies to be healed, but individuals with their own stories, their own needs, their own fears. The advocate system has helped us to bridge that gap, to connect with our patients on a human level, and to provide them with the dignity and respect they deserve. The team won the award, of course. It was a moment of triumph, a validation of all the hard work and dedication that had gone into building the system. As I stood on the stage accepting the award alongside my fellow volunteers, I looked out at the audience, at the faces of my colleagues, at the faces of the senior management, at the faces of the patients and their families, and I saw something that warmed my heart. I saw a shift in perspective, a collective recognition that compassion and empathy were just as important as medical expertise. The legacy of Arthur, the forgotten pensioner, lived on in the halls of St. Jude's, not in grand monuments or sweeping reforms, but in the quiet acts of kindness, the small gestures of compassion, the unwavering commitment to ensuring that no one was ever forgotten again. And that, I knew, was a legacy worth fighting for, a legacy that would continue to inspire me every day as I walked the wards, listening to the stories, holding the hands, and reminding each patient that they were seen, they were valued, and they were not alone. Even in death, Arthur had made a difference. I understood now. It was hard fought, and for once, it worked. The end.